that you are drawing connections between technological diversity and linguistic and cultural diversity in ways that are really important. And so I wanted to contribute to that a little bit of a sense of history and try to see how some of the history of Englishes as a discipline might inform some of our contemporary conversations. My basic claim in this talk is that the discipline of English in the 20th century has been shaped by recurring rhetorics of crisis about technological and demographic change. So we've been freaking out about these things for a really long time. Of course, our moment is unique, but there are a lot of past freakouts that speak to our contemporary time. I'm going to try to drill down into some of those. So why look back? First of all, we can shift the ground of the contemporary field by telling a more capacious vision of our field's past. You know, one of the things that worries me is when we tell histories that position the past of the field as only alphabetic and only focused on standard English, we actually just reinforce that narrative. And so I want to tell a different narrative of a more open history of the field. But at the same, and that was really the narrative that I was trying to tell in my book that some of you have read, Remixing Composition. But increasingly, when I ended that project, I got interested in the second question, and that's why people have been calling for a multimodal future and for attending to linguistic diversity in the field for a really long time. And yet, in a lot of ways, the field ain't changed. And I want to know what are some of the social and material forces that keep the field fundamentally conservative in a lot of ways, despite the really interesting work that has been done over many years. And in many ways, I think that's the direction I'm moving in as a historian these days. Okay. The basic arc of this talk is the first thing I'm going to do is try to take the history farther back. In my book, I only went back to the 60s. Here, I want to go back to 1912. And I'm going to present a distant reading of Responses to Technological Crisis in English Journal, 1912 to 1970. This is collaborative work with Ben McCorkle of Ohio State. And then, inspired by your talk, I want to drill down into a close reading of a few of the ways, some deeply problematic, some really revolutionary, that scholars were engaging with technological change and linguistic diversity in English Journal in the 60s and 70s. And if there's time at the end, I intend to end on a rousing call to action so that we are moving to the 21st century. The 21st century, they only get like 3 minutes of time, but I figure that's because I end and you all will collectively in our Q&A map out the 21st century for us, and in the talks I'm super excited about seeing later on today. So, first of all, why English Journal? First of all, it's just really old. It's sort of the longest running journal dealing with English pedagogy, in the field, and it has a very accessible, although problematic when it comes to text searching, archive in JSTOR. So that's one reason. The other reason, though, is that I found in my own research that some of the most interesting work on multimodal pedagogy was actually happening in the K-12 space and not the college space, and so I think it was really interesting to recover that. And also, if I'm interested in the cultural forces that cause English to keep on becoming more conservative despite radical visions, we really got to go all the way back. It is many ways in the K-12 system in which the cultural image of what English is and what it isn't as a subject is formed, and so I think doing that kind of archaeology is important. And the graphs I'm going to show you today stop in 1970, but our goal is to continue this all the way to 2012, so we have 100 years, and then to add in C's and maybe college English too. So this is very much work in progress, a different kind of methodology than I've done before. So first of all, why distant reading? For me, this is an evolution. My past history was case study work, and what I realized is I pretty much cherry-picked interesting stuff in the past in order to tell a rosy vision of multimodality to influence change in the present. I called that remixing. I didn't call it cherry-picking. I had a bit more of a theoretical angle for it. But anyway, I felt like it was useful, but I also had a sense there was a lot of stuff that I came across, like all this cool stuff in the English Journal, that couldn't fit into that case study methodology. And so I needed a methodology that could help me, and that could help Ben and I deal with just a wider variety of texts. And so I was influenced by Franco Moretti's idea of distant reading. I was also influenced by Derek Mueller's work on data visualization in the field, demonstrating ways that graphs can function as a kind of abstracting practice, as a way to get a handle on what's going on in the large corpus of texts in the field. And also it's attracted to data visualization because it's actually enacting a kind of multimodal scholarship. It is using the visual in order to make arguments about the field, and I think that's important. Okay, so let's do a really quick distant reading of English Journal. So the key questions that Ben and I brought to this project are, first of all, how have media technologies influenced the teaching of English in the 21st century? So we're really interested in how does the introduction of a new technology, both build on and transform the older technologies? And finally, we were really interested in new media moments. If we could look back to that moment when film was new, that moment when radio was new, what could that teach us about the ways we're encountering new technologies such as Twitter and Vine and whatever has been invented just this week? What can we learn about those new media moments in the past that might help us think about how to deal with these new media moments we have right now? So I won't get too much into methodology, but basically we just, over a period of several months, read titles for all articles in JSTOR and opened anything that had any hint of media technology in it. We developed a coding scheme. We recorded all of our data in a Google form so it could come out in a spreadsheet that we could do things with. It was a really iterative and collaborative project. We traded off years, but at first we read several of the same years together. We came up with making sure we were reading things in similar ways, and then kept leaving notes for each other and re-reviewing when we weren't sure how our coding scheme fit, and so we made some changes to the coding scheme across time. So just to give you a really quick overview, here's a graph of just the media focus of the articles we found. So you can see over 90 articles about film, over 60 articles about radio, over 40 articles about television, and then a whole bunch of other stuff as well in this time period. So we definitely have a big corpus of articles. One plus of English Journal is the articles are relatively short and pedagogically focused, so it made it slightly easier to actually read all 360, but nonetheless, there's quite a bit. So this is a timeline of just articles about multimedia, and what this really tells me is that our field has been engaging with multimedia since the beginning, and it's not a linear progress narrative either. It's a narrative of ebb and flow. Well, 1920, apparently looks like that was the time that the field just hated media. But other than that, there's always been some discussion of media technologies, beyond the book involved in the field. So, and most of these are K-12 articles, or focused on K-12 as a site, but not all of them. And part of the reason is, especially in its early years, English Journal was a really robust site of discussion of college-level pedagogy as well. But I just wanted to make sure that I was letting you know that. Okay, so the big, and I can tell you more about other stuff we found, but today the big thing I'm going to focus on is the production versus reception. So this is one thing we coded all the articles for. And we define production as students using media technology to compose, although we expanded this over time to or composing in media genres. And an example of that expansion is in the radio moment in the field. Some people in high schools were really actually making radio programs that were broadcast on radio stations to broader publics because of the politics of access. Some were composing radio scripts and sometimes speaking into a broomstick or speaking behind a screen in order to replicate the feeling of radio so you could get a voice that was disembodied in some ways. And we still counted that as production because it was a pedagogy that was inspired by the media to have students make media, though sometimes they played around with it. As opposed to reception, which we coded as this is really about the students analyzing the media, but they're not actually composing that genre, or it's really about presentational aid or teacher grading aid, so it would be more teacher-centered in that sense. So that was how we coded reception. So first of all, one interesting trend we know is when we collapse all visual technologies together, we see that there was more discussion of visual technology than audio technology, but the visual was much more deeply connected to reception. Whereas audio gets much more interesting. There was less discussion of audio technologies, but a higher discussion of audio production. And I think there are a couple reasons for that. In some ways, audio production may have seemed a bit more accessible. Also, there's a long tradition of integrating speaking into the teaching of English, so it may have been easier for teachers to imagine that as a kind of production tool. But anyway, it's definitely an interesting trend. But even on the visual, I think it usefully contests the history that visual production is new in the field, but people have been thinking about this for a long time, even if it wasn't the dominant trend in that data. And I really love this timeline. Reception is the top line and production here. One of the things we can see is that it's not an easy ebb and flow. Like we can see that the 1930s, for example, were a really exciting moment of media production in the field that I haven't seen a lot of discussion of, and this really helps us see that moment in some interesting ways. And then actually, in some ways, as the field sediments further, it focuses more and more on reception, and production starts dropping out. So I just want to drill down into this in terms of a few kinds of media. So first of all, you see here with film that film starts out mostly focused on reception. When it's new, it's sort of something we're analyzing or we're using as an aid to teaching literature. But then there's this spike in the 30s where people actually start making films, and often making films, sometimes filmed versions of literary texts, but sometimes films that are trying to reach public audiences. And then it drops out, and film sediments into just another kind of literary text that we can analyze. But then the Super 8 comes in, and new consumer-grade technologies come in. There's a little blip at the end, and now because there's new film technology and film production technology, we start seeing production coming back, and I'm super excited to be able to see what happens in the 70s, 80s, and at 4Cs we're going to present at least 100 years of this. That's sort of our deadline to get the next phase done. So radio has a similar trend, except in this case the production started almost immediately as opposed to having to naturalize it with reception first of all. And then you get a rise in reception later. So there seems to be this moment of crisis. We're not sure what radio is for. Let's do lots of different things with it. And then over time the field says, okay, let's just tell people how to read it critically. And let's not make it. And so there's an interesting trend that we're noticing over time. Now, TV, in an interesting way, kind of bucked this trend in that production just never really caught on with TV in the same way as it did with some of the others. And I'm not entirely sure what the reason was for that. I think one thing is that TV just really seemed to freak English teachers out more than any other technology as something that they really had to resist and teach students to resist. And then I think part of it is, again, the realm of access concerns and sort of the feeling that making TV was just not possible. And that a lot of the interest was actually on teachers making TV for like televised lectures, for example, which we coded as reception. So. Also, I just love this. We in fact have proved that yes, TV did kill the radio star. And you can see this really clearly when you map radio and TV together on a graph. And I think this is sort of a really important thing to remember, that the field also seems to have this tradition of getting really excited about something new and then the next thing comes along and we stop talking about it. And that was a super loss because radio was where the production was happening. And we killed radio, we actually kind of killed production in the field. And that's really problematic. So I think that's a good caution for those of us who get tempted to get excited about the new tech thing and be like, no, we can't possibly talk about blogs. I mean, you know, that's not this year. That was the 2004 and 2008 moments. You know, it causes us to be a little bit probably a bit more wary of that. In the interest of time, I'll just gloss this really quickly. One of the things that we did is we coded the data for just the kinds of arguments that people were making. I think this is really humbling for those of us who do work in computers and writing, because this looks like every article I've ever published. I've made several of these arguments. First of all, I think it's important to note that the new technology is harming the kids. They can't read or write anymore. It was not actually as prevalent as we thought, though what was really prevalent was something like, the kids really like this new media, we should use it to convince them to read. Maybe we'll have them have radio versions of Shakespeare, maybe TV versions of Shakespeare. So there was a lot of that. Or we'll have them write radio scripts because that'll get them excited in writing. But for the most part, the dominant argument was really, let's get on this media stuff, but interestingly enough, more conservatively, in order to help alphabetic reading and writing. But I also think it's really exciting that There was a big emphasis on new technologies, whether it be the mimeograph or radio, as a way for students to write to audiences beyond the teacher. So there was a kind of disruption of teacher-centered pedagogy that was aligning with technology in interesting ways. The argument that what literacy means and what English has to mean must change because of new technology turns out to be a really old one. And then there's a code that we developed later on, and we're in the process of recoding back to 1912 on. There's also a real tendency to say, English teachers need to be involved in this media because the students are watching crap and we need to tell them what they should be watching or listening to. And while we don't have this kind of attitude expressed in the same way as these older teachers did, this sort of emphasis on we need to be involved primarily for media critique and to help people read more critically is definitely an argument that continues to circulate today. So I can talk more about some of the graphs later, but I just wanted to zoom out on just a couple of long view points. So first of all, I think one thing that our data really brought home for me is that the field actually has been largely receptive to new media in a lot of ways, but there has been a tendency to position new media as a support for literary reading and for alphabetic writing, rather than to deal with it on its own terms and to think about how it transforms the field. So that's definitely a trend that we observed. We also did observe that it's true that media reception has predominated over production, but production has often been emphasized when media are new. So the new media moment is a moment where production can take hold. And it's been emphasized more so with audio than visual media over time, so we found that out. And this also really confirms Self and Hauscher's claim that media literacies have lifespans. So we can really see that there are moments in which a media literacy takes hold in the field and then it drops away. But one thing I find interesting is that film so far has a surprisingly strong persistence, and I'll be curious to see if that continues to happen, especially when we add and video, but if the moving image actually turns out to be the thing that has resisted this obsolescence. I'm not sure yet, but that's something I want to track because it went against the kind of general sense. Okay, so that's a snapshot view of technological crisis. But inspired very much by your super exciting conference call, I wanted to spend a little time taking a look at the ways that technological and linguistic diversity were intersecting in discourses in English Journal in the 60s and early 70s, because there's some really interesting things there. So one of the reasons I want to do this is I want to do some thinking about the cultural politics of remediation, and I definitely mean that as a pun, both how new technologies remediate the old, but also how technologies get sedimented into racist and classist and ableist versions of remediation. And so there's some tropes that we came across in reading through the entire corpus of English Journal. That there is an ongoing trope of new media as a force that's causing people's language to change, and English teachers need to come in and uphold the standard. And that was definitely something that we saw over and over in our data. There also has been a tendency in a lot of these articles to position media technologies as particularly helpful for students who are marginalized in one way or another, and these kind of marginalizations usually are related to race, class, and ability in a lot of ways. And it's being seen as a remedial aid to help people fit into essentially the white middle-class codes favored by many in the English discipline. And also, just as an aside, the whole idea that technology could be a way to replace teacher labor, really old, and I can tell you more about that in Q&A. But that's another problematic trend running around there. And we could talk about the problematic trends forever, but this one, 1962, article is called Slow Learners, Instructional Tapes and Insight. And this was coming out of Detroit in 1962. And it's really interestingly coded. It's a use of audio tape to correct regional speech variation. And actually, the word black or African American or actually is not used at all in the English Journal article, but I tracked down the record at the Smithsonian, and the teacher tells a narrative of adapting to the rising number of African Americans in Detroit and how she developed this pedagogy as a way, presumably, to help them. And I'll talk a little bit more about this, but I'm just going to go ahead and play a little bit of the record. up with the quote up here because I think that kind of says it all.
People also forget to put the S sound where it belongs. Often, parking lot attendants will say, "It's 50 cents," and are thereby judged to be uneducated. Remember, we are always being judged by what we say and by how we say it. Educated people respect their language and avoid the little speech differences that make negative reactions.
Repeat these phrases quickly. 1 man, 2 men, 1 cent, 2 cents.
Okay, so it goes on and on, believe me, but I think that's probably about all we can take. I do think there's something really classic in the fact that the paternalistic, we just want to help you succeed and have other people not think you are educated is the voice of the woman, connected to ethic of care, and then the voice who actually has the standard is a man saying, "Repeat after me." So there's some really interesting gender politics on literacy here as well. In addition to, an adaptation from foreign language pedagogy to address issues of linguistic diversity by attempting to hold to a particular standard. This, on the one hand, critiquing this, obviously all of us in the field understand why this is problematic, and yet, as a person teaching on a campus with a rising number of international students, I deal with people every day who really wish that we in our ESL composition pedagogy would have a pedagogy more like this. And so I think it's really important for us to remember that audio technology can be a disruptive force in the field, but it can just as easily be a tool of oppression. And I think that critical insight, we can see it more clearly in the past. We can now see how those discourses are also mapping onto discussions of new media in the field today. But I didn't want to just end you on a downer. So that is not all that happened in English Journal in this time period. And I also think it's interesting that this happened in Detroit. And I'm going to turn to Geneva Smitherman, who had a regular column in the early 70s in English Journal called Soul and Style. And I think this is really interesting because it's what she's writing before students write to their own language. Resolution comes out. And she's practicing. Why is this not going forward? There you go. Okay, so that's the really great header. And honestly, I think this quote pretty much is the best mission statement we could have for how to work with media in the 21st century I've yet read, so that's part of the reason I wanted to bring it out. She says, "Dig it. Today's students will become the employment managers, businessmen, and social managers of tomorrow. It ain't too far-fetched to talk about the English language arts teacher as an agent of social change. If English teachers would work to change attitudes about dialects, both in and wherever possible outside of school, it would be a major step in the direction of a humane social universe." So when we think about new media technology, what would it mean to center the idea of using new media for social change and using new media to value multiple ways of speaking and writing? I think that revisiting some of Smitherman's work in this time period is just a good reminder of an alternative vision that I think is worth continuing going forward on. I also wanted to bring out in my book, I spent a lot of time thinking about how Smitherman was arguing for integrating speaking and writing and discussions of language diversity altogether in composition. But she was also really strongly advocating for a multimedia turn in the field in this time period, which is something I didn't get a chance to talk about in the book. So here's just one quote from the same column. She writes, "We live in a multimedia world where most of our important and even complex information and ideas are acquired and transmitted through audio, oral, visual processes. Critically examine various media, noting how visual arrangement, selection of material, style of presentation, and the like all help to color our perceptions of reality and convey hidden messages." And after this, she goes on to talk about the politics of race in beauty ads in the time period, and she goes on to talk about the problematics of the blaxploitation genre, and how ultimately we needed to be teaching students the kind of critical media literacy to recognize and speak back to racist representations in media. And I think that that's really important because if we think about the English teacher as an agent of social change, we need to be out there contesting conservative ideas on language in the public sphere and engaging with students in doing that kind of work. And so I think in many ways, of course, Smitherman's work is really well known in the field, but one thing I think that's problematic is she tends to be cited in discussions of language diversity. And so this is my point here. We ought to be citing Smitherman more in discussions of technological work as well. And I can think of Adam Banks as, for example, one scholar that is already making this kind of connection. But in my history here, this is something I'm trying for. So, all right. Also, just go back and read all those columns because they are awesome. Like they are what the kind of scholarship we ought to be doing. Anyway, that's just an aside. Okay. So I'm just going to end on kind of 3 lofty goals here. And it looks like I might actually stay pretty close to 30 minutes, which is my goal, because I really wanted to privilege conversation over lecture. So I'm excited that I just talked fast enough, apparently. Okay. So one of the things that my tour through English Journal has taught me is that we really need to be doing more work on a field-wide level to be collaborating with K-12 educators in working to transform both normative and popular understandings of English as a discipline, to be engaging much more broadly in moving to Englishes, as you have so smartly done. But I think it really has reminded me that not only is the K-12 sphere a place where a lot of really innovative pedagogical thinking has happened and is continuing to happen, but also if we're really going to change our field at the college level, we have to change it all the way down. Because otherwise, the rest of the culture has a sedimented version of English, and it's going to be really hard for us, individual composition teacher, to change that. So we need to be thinking at a field-wide level. The next thing is, I spent a lot of time thinking about, well, why was it that we produced media early on, and then, ultimately we sedimented it into reception and production went away? Why is this a trend that happens over and over in the field? And why, despite soul and style, besides students write for their own language, am I still fighting the same old language diversity battle, at my university, despite all this great work and really smart things that have been said in the past? And I think the reason is we actually never really changed our scholarship. During this time period, English Journal was a very print-heavy technology, and we have certainly made great strides. We are changing towards multimodal production. We have journals like Kairos, Computers and Composition Online. We have lots of journals that are doing multimodal work. But I think we need to be even more radical. And I think we need to write more like Soul and Style. So not only do we need to be publishing web-based scholarship and integrating video, but we need to be doing more work where we're practicing code meshing. And more work where we're practicing what I would call vernacular multimodal composing, where we actually start with a genre that's not the academic essay, and refuse to make some of the concessions one would have to make it count as an academic essay. And here's where I get to the pitch moment. First of all, I just wanted to note that, and I can send people the link, or actually I think it's on my Twitter feed right now. I'm currently trying this out with a project where I'm attempting to make queer activist videos about queer activist video, and trying to practice a kind of code meshing where I am speaking in a sometimes profane queer voice and sometimes academic voice at the same time. And I'm really considering sending this out without writing a really long academic-ese introduction, but really trying to say, let's claim this genre itself. And then the other area where I'm trying to do this, Ben McCorkle's clearly all over this project because he and I are co-editing a special issue of Harlot on digital activism, and we're really calling for pieces that analyze digital activism, but that also enact it, and we're defining the digital really broadly there. So deadline's January 15th. If you got ideas, talk to me, but we're really trying to welcome those areas. So I think for me, it's a call for us to really try to do more work to practice the kind of literacies we want to take hold in the field in our scholarship, and to be as brave as is possible, with the understanding that it's easy enough for me to make this call as a tenured member of the professoriate, and it is harder for people in other positions. Although I guess I would say that we have to start practicing a little revolution every day so that when you all get to your tenured professoriate position, you'll be more ready to take hold of it and won't be entirely interpolated by the system. Or at least I think that was my strategy when I was writing a print book about multimodality but doing avant-garde art stuff on the side, Kind of worked for me. So, and I also want to make a call for code meshing as something everyone in the field can do. We all speak multiple codes. Academic discourse is a fiction. Let's stop believing in it. And let's start speaking in different ways. And not just kind of having code meshing be something that only particular people do. And then I guess finally, the thing I would say is that this whole project really is a deep reminder to me that we need to engage in media inventively, also contextually, understanding that it's always bound by its historical locations. Definitely critically understanding that it is not necessarily always a tool for change, it is sometimes a tool